Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you to my history reaction channel. Today we're going to be talking about the Great Northern War by Kings and Generals. This will be part 1 of 6, the Battle of Narva. Now because this is going to be a long series, 6 of them, I'd originally hoped to do it in 5, but it looks like I'm going to be needing 6 to get it done. We will probably be doing a few short videos alongside this, maybe every other day or so. And when this is over, we're going to be going straight into the oversimplified two-parter Cold War. Now, what I'm thinking for the rest of this week is for the next 6 days, we're going to be taking a look at the Great Northern War. But I will also toss in some relatively short videos on radiation history, atomic era history, nuclear accidents, that kind of thing, to give a little variety as we get through this and into the Cold War by Oversimplified. And when I say get through this, I do not want to imply this is a slog. What I'm really trying to say is this is not going to be for everybody, and I really don't like tying up an entire week on one topic if I can avoid it. So I think this is a good compromise. So those who either aren't interested in this but want something to see, there'll be some other things showing up. And for those who just want a little change of pace, but also want to see this, there'll be some other things showing up. So hopefully I can make everybody happy with this. And as always, I will put a link to Kings in General in the description below to their original video. I really highly encourage people to head over to Kings in General and show them some support, because these guys are one of the best channels I know out there for getting into the deep nitty-gritty details of what they do. They tend to make long videos, they tend to make long series, and they do really well at making these videos, both from in terms of the research and in terms of production value. They're just spectacular, and we want to encourage this channel to keep doing this, because not a lot of people out there are willing to tackle topics in this depth and at this length, because a lot of people are turned off by long videos. We all know it. Unfortunate, but it's true. And not everybody's interested in deep dives. Me, I'm not a military historian. I went to a school where most of my classmates were military historians, but that's just kind of how that worked. But the military aspects, the military details have never been my strong point. Well, I don't know how much I'll be able to contribute this time. I will contribute everywhere I can, because that's what I'm here for. But don't expect me to be giving a lot of details on specific tactics, on specific unit types, weapon types, because that's just not something I know a lot about. With that said, I am fairly familiar with this war. I haven't seen this video before, but I'm familiar with the war, especially from the Russian perspective. So I think I can add more when we get to that. And I expect I'll be adding a lot of trivia, because I'm really good at random facts about historical events that are outside the normal things that people like to talk about. So hopefully I can at least add some in that respect. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble. So let's just get into this and let's just see where it takes us.
The Great Northern War marks the culmination of the tumultuous past couple of centuries in Northern Europe. This war not only changed the balance of power in the region, but on the continent as a whole.
Yeah, because it was. The 17th century was very tumultuous. So was the 16th, but especially the 17th, especially in the region we're talking about here. And in this period, you got all these different wars going on. Russia goes through its time of troubles. Sweden is expanding. Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth is kind of at its height, is about to start going into decline. So it's really kind of a chaotic time in Europe, especially Eastern Europe. But even in Western Europe, it's kind of chaotic in this period.
At the end of the conflict, one of Europe's newest and most militarized powers lay in ruins, and from its ashes, an empire previously on the fringe of European affairs would start its explosive rise.
So what we're talking about is the I don't want to say fall of Sweden, but certainly the fall of the Swedish Empire. Sweden at this time is one of the great European powers. It is much larger than what we think of as Sweden today. We'll get into that a little more if they don't, but Sweden was huge, and it's going to get huger huger, much even not much larger, but larger during the Great Northern War. But by the end, it's going to see a lot of its territory, and at the same time, one of the European countries kind of on the fringe that was always kind of there, but wasn't really taken serious very much by the rest of Europe, is suddenly going to rise in power and become a lot more prominent in Europe. And of course, I'm talking about the Russian Empire. So this is kind of the period where you see Sweden decline, Russia rise. And that's kind of the story of the Great Northern War, if you want to take it from the broadest context. It's also going to be a story of the decline of Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian complex. There's a lot going on here, so let's keep going.
This episode, we will talk about the events that led to the beginning of the Great Northern War and cover the Battle of Narva, one of the most interesting engagements of the era. Speaking of interesting, the sponsor of this video, Gemstone Legends, is one of the coolest new puzzle RPG games in 2021, with...
Okay, for those of you who aren't aware, I will let ads run if the video is less than 3 months old. If it's more than a year old, like this one is, I generally skip over them. Because at that point, any offers are almost always over by then. There's just no point in forcing you guys to watch it. All right.
The ascension of Gustavus Adolphus.
Actually, let's stop right here real quick. Anybody who really gets deep into history probably doesn't need to hear this. But for people who are just casual historians or just interested in this stuff, one thing that we have to be careful about when we're talking about the past is assuming things then were the way they are now. And I know that sounds like common sense, but it's surprisingly easy for people to forget, even people who take history kind of serious. For example, let's look at this map here. I was saying earlier, Sweden, at the start of this war, is much bigger than we think of it now today. And you can see that right here, because it's got Finland, it's got parts of the Baltic coast, up along where you'd find parts of Prussia, or not Prussia, but Livonia, Estonia, and all those. Got the Holy Roman Empire instead of Germany. You have Germanic states at this time, but no Germany that even remotely resembles what we think of as Germany today. Same thing kind of applies to a lot of this. Italy is a bunch of states, got Naples, the Papal States. Parts of northern Italy are part of the Holy Roman Empire, along with a lot of the German states. Poland and Lithuania are a commonwealth, and they contain a lot more territory than either of them do later. I'm not sure about this particular point in time, but at some point in time, they're going to have parts of Ukraine, for example, parts of Belarus, parts of the Balkans. You got the Habsburgs over here. That's going to be where you get Austria-Hungary. You have the Habsburg dynasty is extremely influential at this time. Of course, you got the Ottoman Empire. That's gone now. It's been gone for quite a while now. But it controls all this area down here. It's constantly in conflict with Russia. So it's a very different world. So when we're talking about Sweden, for example, we're not talking about the Sweden we think of today. When we talk about, for example, in a video somebody says Germany, there really is no Germany. Now, there is a kingdom of Germany, but it falls under the Holy Roman Empire. I'm not even sure if the kingdom of Germany is there at this time. I think it is. But like I said, so much of it is convoluted. But it's primarily just a lot of loose allied German states. And by allied, I mean that quite loosely. At various points in our history, they're just as likely to fight each other as they are anybody else. Anyway, enough about that. It's just something that I wanted to caution people about, especially when we're talking about this. The Russia we're talking about at this time, the Sweden we're talking about this time, the Poland or the Lithuania we're talking about at this time resemble what we know now, but they're not the same. They're very different.
To the throne of Sweden in 1611 is generally regarded as the starting point of the Swedish Empire. The able young king inherited a multitude of conflicts in the region, most notably the Ingrian War against the Tsardom of Russia. The war was concluded with the Peace of Stolbovo in 1618, which stipulated that Sweden would gain Ingria and parts of Karelia, thereby denying Russia access to the Baltic Sea.
And that's a big deal to Russia. We've talked about this in other videos, but Russia has always been desperate for seaports. The main one they have at this time is going to be in Ingria. And up here, like in places like Arkhangelsk, they're going to be fighting a lot, trying to get Black Sea access as well. That's one of the reasons they have so many conflicts with the Ottomans, for example. So losing access to the Baltic is going to really be a big deal for the Russian Empire.
Russia, which was still recovering from the time of troubles, was unable to offer any significant resistance to Swedish expansion.
Yeah, so the time of troubles, let's talk about that really briefly. That's a period from, historians will debate exactly when it starts, but generally I would say 1598 to like 1613 is generally what we're talking about. It's a period of complete unrest in the Russian Empire. There's so much going on. There's the Rurik dynasty that's been ruling for hundreds of years, finally collapses with the death of Ivan the Terrible's son, Theodore. Boris Godunov takes over. He's not really well liked or trusted by anybody, A, because he's a former boyar, B, there's rumors going around that he had one of Ivan the Terrible's sons assassinated, and that's how he got the throne. And most important of all, he's not of the bloodline, which is a big deal at this time. He is an usurper. Any way you look at it, he's a usurper from the perspective of the people. He's not chosen by God. He's not a Rurik. So there's a lot of unrest. Then they get hit by a massive famine, 1601 to 1603. That causes even further unrest. The famine combined with Boris Godunov being elevated especially is bad because the Russian people are seeing this as a sign of God's displeasure. I chose the Ruriks to rule you. This guy, according to some people, killed off the last of the Ruriks and took over. So this is a sign of God's displeasure. There's rebellion. There's a wave of them. There are people claiming to be that son Godunov murdered, Dmitri. There's a series of Dimitris. They're called the false Dimitris. Sometimes this part of the time of troubles is called the Dimitriad. There's the three major ones, and there's actually more than that, but really complicated. I don't want to get into that. That's a video for another day. But the takeaway of this is there's dynastic upheaval. There are multiple changes in administration during this period. One of the false Dimitris captures Moscow, takes over the throne from the son, I believe, of Boris Godunov, if I remember correctly. And then he is taken out by one of the other boyars. And then Poland-Lithuanian complex invade, captures Moscow, and puts the son of the Polish king on the throne of the Russian Empire. So you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. There's just this wave after wave, there's change after change, and then it lasts until a popular uprising led by forces initially in Nizhny Novgorod head down to help liberate Moscow. And there is a general council held where the Romanov dynasty is put in place. The Romanovs did have marital ties to the Ruriks, specifically to the line of Ivan the Terrible. So they were the logical choice. The church got behind it and they were able to move forward. But this leaves Russia very weak, very destabilized, pretty much all through the 17th century. And this is coming right out of that.
The war with Poland-Lithuania, which had been sporadically raging on since 1600, was concluded in 1629. Gustavus Adolphus was not able to force Sigismund III of Poland to renounce his claims on the Swedish throne, but he was able to keep most of Livonia, including the important port city of Riga, and gain valuable trade concessions. In 1618, one of the most destructive conflicts in history, the 30 Years' War, had started as well. Although the last phases of the Swedish-Polish War are considered to be a part of the 30 Years' War, the Kingdom of Sweden did not involve itself directly in the war before the King of Denmark, the former champion of Protestantism, had been defeated.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with the 30 Years' War, you really should look into it. It's one of the bloodiest wars in history, and it is I mean, there's always a lot going on, but it's really a holy war. It's a war between the Catholics and the Protestants. And ground zero tends to be the Germanic states. The German people suffer horrendously during the 30 Years' War. There are just massive atrocities during this period. It's one of those wars that are just, if there were war crimes at this time, I think they would have violated every last one of them. We'll just put it that way. So yeah, Sweden comes in. They're going to take over as the champion of the Protestants. Again, Catholic Germany is ground zero for this, but it's very much a Protestant versus Catholic war.
Worried about Catholic domination in the empire, Gustavus Adolphus, who was a leader of a Protestant nation himself, intervened on the Protestant side. Although the Catholics were close to a complete victory, the Swedish involvement changed the tides of the war. Sweden's superior army dominated the battlefield even after the death of Gustavus, and by 1648, the war was grinding down to a stalemate. Large parts of Europe, especially the Holy Roman Empire, were left decimated demographically, economically, and militarily. In contrast, the Kingdom of Sweden, by acquiring territories in Pomerania and Bremen-Verden at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, became the preeminent power in the Baltic region and one of Europe's leading states.
Yep. So look how big Sweden is here. By the end of this, they've got what we talked about before, but they've added Livonia and a little more as well.
Sweden may have been the dominant power in Northern and Eastern Europe. However, its supremacy in the Baltic was incomplete. Only several years after the Peace of Westphalia, they went to war against Poland in what became known as the Deluge. Even though the Swedes were dominating for most of the war, by the end, the coalition assembled against them proved to be too difficult to deal with, and peace was signed.
Yeah, so this is not unprecedented, and it will happen again, I guess I should say. When you have somebody who's getting a little too powerful, a little too strong, you have other nations teaming up to take them down a notch. You see that, for example, with Napoleon. Famously, you see that with Napoleon. He's the obvious example. But you see it here too. You've got Russia and other countries teaming up in an alliance against Sweden to put a stop to this.
The peace was a merely symbolic victory for Sweden, as the Polish monarchs finally abandoned their claim to the Swedish throne. Moreover, it also proved that the Kingdom of Sweden could not survive for too long against an organized coalition of enemies. Charles XI ascended to the throne of Sweden in 1660, and the majority of his rule was peaceful, barring the relatively short Scanian War of 1675 to 1679. During the war, Sweden conquered Scania from Denmark, but lost some of its lands in Germany, mostly due to the inefficiency of the army. After the war, Charles XI revitalized the economy and administration of Sweden. However, his most notable reforms were of a military nature. Those reforms aimed to make the Swedish army one of the best in Europe. Charles XI's death in 1697 left his only son, Charles XII, as the new Swedish king. As Charles XII was barely 15 at the time, Peter I of Russia and Christian V of Denmark saw this as an ideal opportunity to exploit Sweden's apparent weakness.
Okay, this is also not unprecedented. When you get a young king coming to the throne, in the case of Charles XII, he's only 15 when he ascends. He's going to be under a regency temporarily. Some of the rivals are going to see this and see this as an opportunity to either gain ground or, in the case of Russia, to regain ground that they lost to this country. So this happens a lot throughout history. And in this particular case, however, they kind of misjudged the situation.
On the 21st of April, 1699, Russia and Denmark concluded a treaty of mutual assistance in future wars against Sweden. One of the secret articles of the treaty, however, stipulated that Russia would only join the war after it made peace with the Ottoman Empire. Shortly afterwards, Peter concluded a treaty with Augustus of Saxony, who was also the elected ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Augustus was a very proud and extravagant ruler, and his main goal was to return Livonia to the Commonwealth.
Okay, kind of important to remember when we're talking about Augustus. He is from Saxony, but he is the elected ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as well. And that can be kind of confusing sometimes when you're talking about the Great Northern War, especially later on when you start getting a division within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Livonia, although a land that brought insurmountable wealth to the Swedish crown, was also a source of great concern. After Sweden had gained Livonia in 1629 through the Treaty of Altmark, it gave certain assurances to the old Livonian nobility that they would preserve the rights that they had had under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that they would not lose any of the lands that were in their possession. For the first couple of decades, the relationship between the Swedish monarchs and the Livonian nobility was amicable. Charles X, however, was not as lenient as his predecessors, and by 1655 he intended to revoke a quarter of the lands that belonged to the Livonian nobility, only with the Second Northern War preventing him from doing so. Charles XI would turn his father's plans into a reality after ascending to the throne, and by the time of his death in 1697, the Livonian nobility held only a fifth of the original number of estates. One of the nobles.
Yeah, so that's going to lead to resentment as well. So you're going to see individuals within Livonia also wanting to do something about the Swedish problem, so to speak.
Johann Reinhold Patkul, outraged by the Great Reduction, agitated the Livonian nobility to rise up against Sweden in rebellion. He was swiftly arrested and sentenced to death, and to avoid execution, Patkul fled from Sweden. Patkul later played a key role in the formation of the anti-Swedish coalition, as he was usually the diplomatic link between Peter, Augustus and Christian, and provided intelligence on the Swedish defences in the Baltic. Sensing the impending danger, Charles XII sent diplomats to Russia in the summer of 1699, with the goal of confirming a peace treaty between the two states from 1661. A skillful diplomat, Peter the Great assured the envoys of his peaceful intentions, but in reality he had already decided to go to war. Augustus II also sent a diplomatic envoy to Sweden, assuring the king of his friendly intentions and asking for Swedish mediation in a dispute between himself and Prussia.
Don't let them kid you. Charles XII and Augustus II loathed each other. I don't know what it was about them, but those two never could get along.
While all of these dialogues took place, the coalition continued its preparations for war. Ultimately, the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp became alarmed by the Danish naval buildup and informed his ally Charles XII of what had been transpiring. Though both the Swedes...
And that kind of makes sense if you think about it. So Denmark is kind of getting ready to deal with Sweden, but it's being done secretly. Their neighbor sees this, and they're worried that they're the target. That can happen too.
And Holstein had tried to resolve the matter peacefully. The new King of Denmark, Frederick IV, refused to negotiate. The first act of war was committed by Frederick's troops in March of 1700, when the Danish army entered lands belonging to the Duke of Holstein, and shortly afterwards laid siege to Tønning. Simultaneously, on the other side of the Baltic Sea, Saxon forces under Augustus entered Livonia and captured the port of Dunemunda. Charles XII, together with his war council, seeing the Danish threat as more immediate, decided to strike at them first. Great Britain and the Netherlands were uneasy at the prospect of a destructive war in the Baltic, as they had trade interests in the region. Fearing that the conflict might destabilize their economies, the maritime powers deployed their fleets to Øresund to ensure that no lasting harm to trade and their merchants would be done. By August, a Swedish force of 16,000 had assembled in Scania. Though attacking the main Danish army and lifting the siege of Tønning seemed like the most secure way to deal a decisive defeat to Frederick IV, Charles opted for the riskier option of attacking the Danish mainland itself. The Swedish fleet, with Charles himself and his troops on board, managed to outmaneuver their more formidable Danish counterpart and make contact with the British and Dutch fleet. The maritime powers were willing to assist the Swedish king, so the Danish fleet was forced to retreat to Copenhagen. Skillfully avoiding parts of the island where coastal batteries were present, Swedish troops subsequently disembarked on Zealand. The Danish mustered up around 700 men and 7 artillery pieces to attack the Swedish disembarking forces. However, they were no match for the 2,500 Swedish soldiers led by Charles himself. It was here that Charles XII saw battle for the first time and proved himself an excellent leader, being the
Yeah, that is not an understatement. Charles XII he's very aggressive. He is one of those leaders that just doesn't know when to stop, actually. He gets into a fight and he just kind of tends to keep going and don't really concern him. He repeatedly goes up against superior forces or against conditions that would make other leaders hesitate. Disembarkments, river crossings, that kind of thing. Where, yeah, you can do it, but in this case, he's got superior numbers, so it's feasible. But there's going to be times he does stuff like this when he's drastically outnumbered as well. But for a long time, he's going to be winning. He's one of those guys that kind of believes in the cult of the offensive. Whoever attacks first is going to win. And it works for him. And he's going to be right there in the battle. The way I look at him is he's kind of a throwback to the old battle kings of legend and lore. He is very militaristic. He's always there. He's always up there in the front, helping lead the charge in a lot of these situations. A really remarkable guy, especially for his youth, or maybe because of his youth. But yeah, let's keep going.
The first one to jump into the water and lead the assault.
Yeah, see, there you go.
The Danish
So he's the first one to jump in, and that is, from what I understand, that is accurate.
were caught completely by surprise with this move, and were starting to panic, as the Swedish army was within a stone's throw of their capital. A few days after Charles set foot on Zealand, more Swedish soldiers landed there as well, and preparations were made for the march on Copenhagen. Meanwhile, the Swedish, Dutch and British fleets blockaded and started bombarding Copenhagen from the sea. With Copenhagen surrounded on both land and sea, Frederick IV of Denmark made peace with the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, and peace with Sweden was achieved soon afterwards as well, on the 18th of August 1700. The same day that peace was made between Denmark and Sweden, Peter I of Russia declared war on Sweden and began his offensive into Ingria. The first target of Peter the Great's campaign was Narva, a crucial fort near the Baltic Sea. Peter besieged Narva with an army more than 30,000 strong, and with more than 150 cannons. Such an artillery force would have reduced Narva to rubble, where it
Would have is a key word. They've got the guns, but they're lacking on supplies, especially ammunition. That's going to be a problem for Russia in the early part of this war. They're just not really prepared.
Not for the fact that the Russians suffered from a lack of ammunition due to bad roads. With trouble brewing in the west, in what would become the War of the Spanish Succession, the fleet of the maritime powers transported the Swedish army back to the mainland before setting sail westwards.
Okay.
As the Swedish army was fully united, Charles was able to set sail for Livonia. Though Dunamunda fell to Saxon forces quickly and with little resistance, Patkul gravely misjudged the loyalty and intentions of the Livonian nobility. He had expected the Livonian nobility to join Augustus and Riga to fall quickly too. However, Livonian support was minimal, and
that's not really surprising. People rising up, counting on people rising up to support you, doesn't happen as often as a lot of people would like to think it does. You'll hear about this in a lot of wars where there's this idea that if we get in there, they're going to rise up, they're going to help us. And that just, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. To get that to work, you need situations in that area to be bad enough already that people are desperate for a change. They're not desperate for a change. It's human nature to kind of try to stick with the status quo. So, yeah, it doesn't work in this case. A few upset nobles isn't going to be enough.
Saxon forces alone were not strong enough to take the city. Learning of the Danish defeat, Augustus II retreated across the Dunaj River in hope that Charles would agree to a ceasefire. Charles arrived with a part of his army in Pernau in autumn. As Augustus retreated beyond the Dunaj River for winter quarters, Charles decided to head towards Narva and the Russian army. The rest of the Swedish War Council, along with foreign emissaries, tried to persuade Charles to postpone the attack on the Russian army until after the winter had passed.
Okay, now this is interesting. If you know anything about history of invading Russia, you know the golden rule: you don't invade Russia in the winter. And pretty much every general knew that. Napoleon knew that. He thought he would have Moscow subdued and Russia surrendered by the time winter hit. He left much earlier. Same thing later with the Germans in World War II. Their plan had been to have seized Moscow early on, subdue the government, and then they would be able to hold on to the country. The problem is Russia's huge, and the Russians notoriously don't tend to surrender just because you took their capital. They didn't in the time of troubles. They don't with Napoleon, and they don't with the Germans. They're more than willing to keep falling back deeper and deeper into their territory and just pulling you in until winter hits. But here we have Charles XII, who is saying he is going to invade in winter. He's the one that does it, and ironically, he pulled it off.
And the army was united. Charles, however, wished nothing other than to meet his enemy in open battle, and not even the knowledge of the size of the Russian army could dissuade him. While marching towards Narva on the 7th of November, a part of the Swedish army clashed with a Russian raiding party under the command of Boris Sheremetyev at Jõhvi.
Okay, let's talk about Boris Sheremetyev. He is going to be a major player in this war on the Russian side, especially later, but the Sheremetyev family is extremely prominent throughout the history of the Russian Empire. They're one of the oldest families. They're one of the very few noble families that served with distinction, served the Tsars with distinction during both the dynasties, the Ruriks and the Romanovs. In fact, they remain prominent all the way up until pretty much the end. And if you've ever been to Moscow, if you've flown into Sheremetyevo Airport, which is the largest in Moscow, and it is the one that most people coming in from our part of the world, in the United States anyway, and most of Europe, most international flights go to Sheremetyevo. It's named after one of his descendants, well, indirectly. So one of his descendants is going to found a village of dachas at the turn of the 20th century, early 1900s, called Sheremetyev, after himself. And that village is going to give the airport its name. But it's not just that one. The other major airport, one of the other major airports in Moscow, that if you don't arrive at Sheremetyevo, you're probably going to arrive at Domodedovo. That one was built on land owned by the Sheremetyevs. So again, it's a very prominent, very influential family, and they turn up time and time again throughout the history of the Russian Empire. And even later, because like I said, you see their influence on even later Soviet infrastructure, the airports. So I just thought I'd throw that in as random trivia, because I said that's one of the things I can contribute to this.
Though the Russian raiding party suffered relatively heavy casualties compared to the Swedish ones, General Sheremetyev became aware of how far the Swedish army was from Narva. On the 18th of November, Charles XII arrived with his army at the village of Lagena, about 8 kilometers away from Narva. Seeing that many of the horses were ill and that there was heavy snowfall, he knew he needed to act quickly. As soon as he was certain that Narva had not fallen and that his men were ready, Charles left Lagena. Meanwhile, the Russians, being aware that the Swedish army was on its way, began defensive preparations. Trenches were dug around the Narva River's meander, and wooden stakes were placed in the center on the Goldenhof Hill. There were 2 rows of ramparts running alongside the trench as well, and between them there were soldiers' barracks. Several artillery batteries were placed along the trenches, although they would not have any effect on the battle, as the Russian army ran out of ammunition several weeks before.
Right, so Russia has superior numbers, but they do have a problem. Their artillery does not have ammunition. They're having logistical problems. And I said at the beginning of this that I'm not a military historian by any means, but even I know enough to know that logistics is what really wins wars when you get right down to it. You can't get the supplies, if you can't get the food, you can't get the ammunition to the army, you're in trouble.
Sources differ when it comes to the exact size of the Russian army, but modern estimates agree that they had between 35,000 and 40,000 men at their disposal, with the overwhelming majority being infantry. The Russian forces were stretched for over 6 kilometers on their side of the trenches. The Russian army was under the general command of Peter I and Field Marshal Fyodor Golovin. The right wing of the Russian forces were commanded by General Avtonom Golovin, the center by Ivan Trubetskoy, and the left by Adam Veder. The Russian cavalry, placed on the far side of their left wing, near the bank of the Narva River, was commanded by Boris Sheremetyev. The Swedes had around 9,000 men, out of which 5,500 were grenadiers, 3,500 dragoon cavalry, and 37 cannons. The army was split into two relatively equal parts. The right wing contained 3,000 grenadiers, and was commanded by Otto Welling, a veteran of the Scanian War. It was divided into 3 columns, with the one in the center being smaller and being hollow in the middle. The left wing was divided into 2 groups, with one being commanded by Field Marshal Carl Gustav Rientsköld and the other by Magnus Stenbock. Rientsköld had around 1,500 infantry, divided into 2 columns, while Stenbock had 1,000 infantrymen under his command. The Swedish cavalry was positioned on the flanks, mostly in order to guard the infantry against Russian flanking maneuvers. Charles XII himself led the cavalry on the left flank. The Swedish artillery corps, under the command of Johan Hublad, had 16 artillery pieces placed in between the left and right wing of the army, and 21 were positioned on the left wing. Moving his army through the forest and barely passable trails, Charles reached the outskirts of Narva and positioned himself on Germansberg Hill. After performing reconnaissance of the Russian defences, at 10 AM on the 19th, Charles positioned his army in preparation for battle. He was hoping to meet Peter on the battlefield. However,
Of course he was.
the Tsar had left Narva the day before the battle, taking Fyodor Golovin with him. The command of the army was passed to Charles Eugene de Croy, a Saxon diplomatic envoy to Peter. De Croy, aware of his lack of military skill, was initially unwilling to take command of the army. However, it is said that Peter convinced him over a glass of wine. Avtonom Golovin, Veder, and Trubetskoy were just as inexperienced as de Croy was. The most capable Russian commander at Narva was Boris Sheremetyev, although he was passed over for holding a lower rank than the others. The Russian commanders, even though fielding a superior force, were unwilling to commit to open battle, fearing that the Swedish army that they were seeing was merely the vanguard of a much greater unit.
And hesitation does cost victory in battle sometimes. And this is a classic example. They had the numbers. Now you could argue they had a good fortified entrenched position, but they also had the numbers. They probably would have been better off attacking.
The battle commenced when Charles ordered his soldiers to fire 2 volleys at their enemies and advance towards the trenches. At 2 PM, the weather changed. A heavy snowstorm and hailstorm started, and the wind was blowing directly in the face of the Russian soldiers.
So the Russian winter is working against the Russians this time around.
Using the snowstorm as a screen, Charles ordered his men to fill up the trenches with fascines and start directly assaulting the Russian positions. In less than 15 minutes, the Swedish infantry filled up the trenches enough for their cavalry to pass. The Russian soldiers did not see the Swedes until they were right in front of them.
Oops.
The infantry under the command of Rientsköld quickly captured the artillery batteries in the center, while the infantry under Stenbock directly assaulted the Russian army. Due to the number of barracks and the bad positioning of the Russian ramparts, the Russian troops did not have much room to maneuver, and brutal close-quarters combat ensued. where the Swedish soldiers had the clear upper hand. Due to the relentless Swedish assault and the surprise of the attack, the majority of the Russian right flank descended into complete disarray. A large number of the soldiers fled towards the bridge to the north.
Yeah, a choke point, and if I remember correctly, the bridge collapses because of the strain put on it.
Few managed to escape though, as the bridge collapsed under their weight,
Yeah.
taking many men with it to the bottom of the river. Many of the Russian soldiers tried swimming across the ice-cold river as well, with almost all drowning in the process. The soldiers who were left in the trenches also started to flee, only to be forced back by Charles's dragoons. The only part of the Russian right which still posed some organized resistance were the elite Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky guards. They created a wagon fort on the far side of the Russian right wing, near the Narva River. Continuous assaults against the wagon fort did not yield any results.
Yeah, you kind of got them trapped though, and people fight a lot harder when they can't escape. That makes the fight a lot more dangerous. They can't really get across that river behind them, and the enemy's in front and to the sides of them, so they're kind of in trouble. So what they do here is about all they can do. Set up a makeshift defensive position and fight it out.
And the Swedish army suffered heavy casualties. In the meantime, the Swedish right wing saw as much success as the left. The Russian forces were quickly routed, and part of the Swedish right was able to join the left wing shortly afterwards. Sheremetyev, seeing that the cavalry would be useless in this type of close-quarters combat, fled southwards. De Croix, also aware of how dire the situation was, decided to surrender to Charles. As night began to fall, the battle became even more fierce and bloody. Charles drew up many of his footmen in between the city and the entrenchments so that he could not be surprised from any side. Wishing to cut the lines of communication between what was left of the Russian army's wings, Charles ordered Hublot to capture the artillery battery on Goldenhof Hill. By morning, General Golovin surrendered as well. His troops were allowed to keep their arms, as Charles admired the bravery of the two elite guards. General Wiede, learning of the surrender of the right wing, subsequently surrendered the left wing. After receiving the arms and standards of the left wing, Charles allowed the rest of the Russian army to leave over the bridge, which his forces had already repaired.
Quite efficient, Charles.
The battle was a catastrophe for the Russians, as their casualties amounted up to 10,000 men, with De Croix and most of the other commanders ending up as prisoners. The Swedish army, on the other hand, lost less than 1,500 men. To make matters worse for the Russians, the Swedes had captured 143 cannons and 28 mortars, almost the entire amount of artillery that Peter the Great had at his disposal, as well as the entire Russian baggage train.
Yeah. So, this is looking bad for the Russians. Very bad. This is a horrible loss for them. It's a great victory for Charles. But they're both going to take something different away from this battle. Charles XII is going to see this as further confirmation that he is unbeatable, that he is a great military leader, that he can strike at his enemies with impunity. I mean, he went up against superior numbers here in an entrenched position, and he didn't hesitate. He just went in and did it. Peter the Great is a very different type of person. He does have a temper, and that can get him in trouble sometimes, but Peter has always been a reformer. If Charles XII is a warrior king, Peter the Great is a reformer king. He's somebody who's always looking at ways to improve, new things to learn. So Charles XII is going to see this as a victory, and what he's going to learn from that is me going in and being aggressive is going to win battles. What Peter learned is that we need better weapons, we need better training, we need to make sure we have good supply lines and sufficient ammunition, things like that. And he is going to focus on that. He is the kind of person that when he sees something needs to be done, he's going to do it. He's just as aggressive as Charles XII, but in a very different way. Charles XII is more tactical. He tends to think in the moment about the battle right in front of him, Peter the Great is a lot more strategic. He's going to be thinking the big picture of the long game. And that's what's going to make the difference here in the long run.
The Battle of Narva confirmed two things to Europe: that the Swedish army was one of the best, and that the Russian army was as ineffective as it was large. Charles XII, merely 18 years of age, proved that he was a more than capable military commander who, backed by an army of as great quality as the Swedish one, could overcome the insurmountable odds that were stacked against him. With the victory at Narva, a complete Swedish victory in the war seemed like a distinct possibility. On the other hand, knowing that his army was merely beginning to reform, Peter the Great was not disheartened, and he famously remarked, "They have beaten us, they might beat us again, but in time they will teach us how to beat them."
Yep. Yeah, that reminds me a lot of what Grant says in the U.S. Civil War. He basically gets confronted with the fact that he's lost, and he's like, yeah, well, we'll lick him tomorrow. Grant, like Peter the Great, was good at learning from loss and then doing what he needs to do to fix the situation and keep going.
Our series on the Great Northern War will continue soon, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see the next video in the series. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our...
Alright, definitely consider supporting Kings and Generals, even if that just means going over to the channel and, you know, subscribing or watching one or two of their videos, throwing them some likes. We really want to encourage them to keep putting this kind of work into this. So that's the first part, the Great Northern War. We will see what we have next tomorrow. Until then, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.